How's it going, everyone? Welcome. We are here, exploring here now for handling web server actions, and this foundation that everything forward here is based on this foundation. When you are building React applications using Next.js frameworks, what allows you to now is provide all of the infrastructure needed, which is all of this basic stuff that you need to actually build your web application. And that is, that not only when writing your React applications, you need is to transpile that into JavaScript. Why is that? Because React, at the end of the day, it's allows you to create user interface by wrapping those DOM elements on the using the create elements, and of course exposing is some of these convenient methods or these synthetic events that you can go with Vue. However, because that is very tedious to do that, now some folks actually now make this GSX in Facebook, so we can now write our components where at the end of the day, the thing of React is that we are combining is now the markdown with JavaScript. That's what it called is JavaScript extend. So, and also we need is a way to make our code follow certain guidelines. So we can now fix some common gotchas and issues. ESLint. Also, we need to provide some sort of formatting with code formatting like prettier, and how we make sure that this component actually work as expected by writing is now unit testing, and also component testing, where with unit testing you want is to now check if that particular function do what it's supposed to do, and then you have now other things like code coverage, and something that go a little bit beyond of this scope, but it's also important, in how you can test your component, where now is not JavaScript function, is DOM elements. So we use now is the GS DOM to do that, and then a library that allows us to mount those components in this environment that provide is a DOM API, reading and running or on top of Node.js. And now if your applications needs to render on the client and on the server, okay, so how you can make that? What are the specific tools that you can go with? So for example, if you do a client-side rendering, you want to go with React Router, or which is in the case of server-side rendering, you want is to now use some of these built-in tools provided by React. And so if your application cares about the SEO, you might prefer to now render all of those content on the server using is the server-side rendering, or if you want to build a back office or something that doesn't require or where an SEO is not needed, well, you can is now create your client-side applications, right, using React routers. And this is just the tip of the iceberg to describe what are the different stuff that we need to put in place before now writing our web application using React. So Next.js put all of these different pieces together in one single place, and also provide now the stylings that you can go with in this static analysis with TypeScript as well. So you can now, at least from version 13 and on, focuses on building your web page using is the file-based routing mechanism. So we also look at how can we work with that by grouping routes and defining is now the routes and the segments, and how you can now get the value or the parameters based on the segments, which is dynamic parameters, and also how you can now is get some slugs if you need that, and how per each one of those files or those folders inside of your file, those files inside of those folders that represent is the routes. Well, you have now some of these convenient components that Next provide for us. So this is great. For example, like the layout. Hey, I just want this to now have this fixed layout, or the template. I want to now, anytime someone get into this page, re-render this template, or the loading screen, the error, the not found, among other pages. So because now React 19 have this way of building this kind of application, or in other words, they now are facing problems from these different rendering modes. Okay, so for example, in the server-side rendering, which happens on the initial page. So when a user navigates to that URL, what happens is, just to briefly describe, is what's going on entirely, is that, well, that request is being sent through the OC model, so you can now pass that information from the application layer across all of these different layer of this open system interconnection, which is the way of how now the data is going to be sent or transformed from the application layer onto the physical one, and then transmit over the cable. So regardless the computer architecture, the computer system they have in place, as long as they have the OC model, they can now is communicate for that. So in other words, when the user navigate, when you navigate to an e-commerce, all right, you hit the enters, that actually pass through all of these different layers. So which is the application that actually communicate with the network services, the season, the presentation, where now is gonna provide that in a valid format of the data. And this is also when the encryption happens. The season is when the connection is established, or this is to determine is from which port you're going to send that data, and all of this port coordination and connections. And then the transport layer will say, hey, which kind of protocols we're gonna use to send this data. It'll be connection based or connectionless, TCP or UDP. It is, in the case of TCP, is HTTP 1.1 or HTTP 2, or it will be WebSockets, or if this is UDP, it will be now Quick, or the HTTP 3, right? So then you have now the internet layer or the network layer that indicates that what is the physical path that this packet will need to go with, and then the data link layer, which is that what will be the communication across and from closest device, when in other words is from the sender and the receiver, the immediate sender and the receiver between these two devices, not the entire path through. All right, this is known as the data frame, which is this message into several frames that can be sent over through the physical layer. So then the other server actually take all of that information in a raw binary stream of data, and then now pass through the OC model in reverse until you now that server get that particular request. Okay, so in the context of server-side rendering, okay, again, this is all assuming that we already established an HTTP connection with that server, which is a connections a connection service. Yeah, we assume is this connection service using the TCP, and of course we already made the handshake, which is made of this 3-step, which is sync, synac, ACK, right? And then there is another layer if you use, for example, HTTPS, which is now sending is the hello through the TLS, which is Transport Layer Secure, to indicate what will be is the communication, what will be the encryption method that we're gonna use. It'll be encryption. It'll be asymmetric. It'll be symmetric, which means that, hey, are we gonna use this now a single public key in the case of symmetric, or are we gonna use now a private and public key for asymmetric encryptions? So, for example, it can be for symmetric encryption, you have now AS is one of the encryption. All right, it's a symmetric block cipher encryptions, or for a asynchronous or for asymmetric encryption, we use now the RS, okay, which is now a public and private key. Or perhaps you want us to now go with the hashing, right? Which now it takes a single input and then generate some outputs, so you can reverse that. So, but in any case, this is assuming that this was a connection based. It was an HTTP connection based protocol. So now, in the context of the web, not too much into the network layer, all right? When we fire up that request, okay, and also assuming that we set a DNS server. So again, there is a lot of things that we are assuming here, but for the sake of the example here, is at least for what we really care about is when that server, when you request that URL, which is you want to go through, get that page on the e-commerce, right? So first the browser now fired up requests, it's sent through the ISP, which is the Internet Service Protocol, and then it now has its own DNS server, which is like phone book, where now it matched the IP address with the name. So now it is send that to the client. The browser can decide to store that IP, so it doesn't need to go to the ISP in subsequent requests. So now that the browser knows the IP, all right, now fire that request to the server. The server, once it passed through all of the things that we already described to, which is now the, in this case, it should be as connection passing through the connection base, or in the through the through the oh my God, did I lose my mind? So when it passed through the HTTP handshake, or the TCP handshake, right? And then establish now a secure connection with the TLS. All right, so the server now send the content pre-rendering on the server, okay? And then you might have is this content that is sent to the client. As a user, you see the content, but it's not interactive because in the background is hurry up everything else to now the server send the client version of those components which take over to provide interactivity. And this happens so fast that you wouldn't even, you don't even think about it. So, because this only happened once, okay, on the server side, if when you want to now solve one of those issues that you have in React applications, especially data fetching on the useEffect, where you have now this network duplication, as well as network waterfalls, and you don't have the ability to catch those requests, and sometimes race conditions. Based on these particular problems that are happening on the client, so React server components say, hey, let's go to now move that logic closer to the data source and run that on the server. And that makes a lot of sense, at least for the React server components. So here we not only are capable to run once, or runs once at build times on your CI/CD server. So you get now is all of those routes pre-rendered, all right, or statically site generations. But also you can now is pre-render that per request using a web server. Now, we went through describing is how we can use the server-side components, and what are the things that we can do here, which is now handling node stuff most of the time is, or fetching data from that at the server level, and then now render the component with all the necessary stuff needed and send that to the client. So it means that these kind of components now have everything that it needs, and it render that and send that directly to the client. So the client doesn't need to actually so the client only can render that component, period. So there is no need to bundle, or there is no need to download or parse JavaScript code, not at all. And this is a good thing because you can now have much more fine control about which components you want to provide interactivity, which is in the case of client side components, where in there you can use now any browser APIs or third-party libraries, or even the custom hooks from React. And we went through a particular example of how can we use now this server component using Prisma, which is an ORM. It's a type-safe ORMs. So what does it mean is that it is an SDK. An ORM is just an SDK. So it guarantees you the same developer experience, regardless is the underlying databases, such as relational database or document base or key value pairs, graph and white column. Right now, Prisma only guarantee you is for relational database and document base. So Postgres, SQLite, and SQL, and SQL Server or SQLite Server, and MongoDB or CodeRoach is supported right now, right? And I think this is this is dope. Yep, that's dope. Because it's focused on it's focused on what is on demand in that market, right? So hey, it's SQL, Postgres, SQLite Server, or document-based database, right? So this is great. And we use now SQLite, which is instead of actually with SQLite Server or Postgres or SQL, we need to spin up a host server to actually do that. SQLite is basically a SQL based on a file, which is great for our needs. So now we describe here the fetching data with Prisma. Some of this kind of concept like serverless environment and connection pooling is something that might go beyond the scope of this. All right. However, it is important to at least know they exist, because for further videos where we're going to talk about more in depth of databases, SQLite services, relational databases, or all the different type of databases, relational, document-based, and get a more practical approach. A key value pair, white column graph. Okay. The idea of this video is only focus our attention on this another concept of React 19, which is server actions. So, because you are here now exploring is how Facebook are solving their own problems, it doesn't mean that it worked for you. However, with that, all right, it is time for us to explore this. So one of the main use case for these server actions is that now this is our particular logic that our server actions allow us to call functions from client components that will be run on the server. So in other words, let's go to put this. So server actions in React 19. That's right. Oh no, is this one? Server actions React 19. That's right. So is this right? So server functions allow client components to call async functions on the server, or async function executed on the server. So what it's doing behind the scene is that, hey, with the directive of use server in any framework that you might use, whether it's Next in our case, or Remix, or Astro, you are telling to the framework, hey, I want you to now create is a reference that you're gonna pass to these client components of this logic or this function that is gonna be run on the server. Okay, so your framework will automatically create is a reference to a server functions and pass the reference to the client component. So when that function is called on the client, React will send a request to the server to execute that function and return the result. This is something that is happening internally with server action. So you tell to the framework, hey, this is now the server code that I want to run when I call that from the client side. And to make you aware of that, I put a use server directive. So when I reference that in the client server, you React behind the scenes is going to now fire requests to that fire request and execute that function on the server, and then provide the result for that. So you may wonder, like, why is all of this wild stuff here? You know, well, glad you asked, because I asked that by myself. So the point of this is on the client side, as I mentioned here, okay, So you can now not only run some of these mutations on the server, and the mutation is just as a function that going to change whatever you store on the data store, whether it's a database or any other data store, okay? Uh, but also, but also is to now uh, deal with form actions. And with form actions, now there's a lot of things going on here, by the way. Because by the time you pass now that reference with form actions to the client component and this server actions that is going to receive now the form data to then perform that async operations. In our case, or in the case of our code, we did that by no, we don't have that. Where is it? 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 Cursor. Really? We don't have that? We don't have that open? I don't believe it. Oh, is this one? Okay. All right. Here, all right. So since we define is interactions under util methods, here is this instance that we're gonna see that, but in the next videos, especially when we go through the intermediate Next.js, as a way to understand that a little bit better. So here, with this function that we define here, which is a server actions, remember, using this label, and then now import that in our client component, which is in our case this component. So what it's doing behind the scene is that, hey, React, now that it creates, or the framework creates this reference of the so it creates now this reference from the server side. It creates this reference on the server functions that can be called from the client component, like this, with the submit button, okay? And now, because we're passing is this form data, which is a part of the API, for those who are not familiar with, this form data, as you can see, this is form data, like so, right? We're passing is this form data. Yep, form data. So new to do actually is going to receive, what we're going to pass is this form data, like so. So if you want to dive a little bit on the forms, this is the action, which is can be a string undefined, and they say, hey, do not use or you will be fired. Experimental form action. This is part of the React synthetic event, right? But again, this is what are the actions that you can pass here as a string, all right? So behind the scenes now, it's creating the framework, the reference of that is creating the reference of that functions, that server, the server action, that function on the server that can be called on the client. So now React behind the scenes is going to fire up that call, or is going to call that server actions, execute that, and give you the result. Now, this is massive. of all the thing that it's doing. Because when we dive deep into this, so by the time that that server function is being run, which means that it is run on the server, here we're passing is the form data, right? And for some reason we try to say, hey, this is the form data we're gonna pass through. That's right. So this is now the form data, right? And when you try to say this form data, like so, you got it. Now it's not complaining about it. It's in fact gonna allow us to get this auto completion feature, which is a great stuff. So by the time we get now that data from the form data, all right, we can get that data as it is, all right, and perform the action, in our case, create that new content, and then once you do that, we want is to now revalidate that path. What does it mean is that by default, any route that we define in our page here under the app router is cached by default. And this is one of the nuance of Next.js, or at least of this framework, where say, hey, I'm going to optimize everything out of the box so you can, along the way, fine tune whatever you need to, right? So once that data is being sent, all right, okay, so once that data has been created, I want you to now is revalidate that patch. I want you to ditch the old catch and then now run this new function and then now run that page at that path, all right, which is now loading is in this case exactly, wait, what? Wait, what? Blah, blah, blah. So, so by the time that now on that to-do page, which is going to render is this one, okay, it is going to now call that page, render that, and inside of that is going to now and inside of that page, right, is going to show now the to-do form, right? The to-do form the to-do form here, no, the to-do here, like that. Exactly. Is a to-do form here, all right? and then it's going to now, oops, wait, what? Exactly. And then it's go to that route, and then you go to that route, call that function that get all of this data, and then populate that. And also behind the scenes is clearing the form, because this server function with form actions is also clearing the form. That's a lot of things that's going on. In this example, request username is a server function passed to a form. When the user submit this form, this is a network request to the server function request username. When calling a server function in a form, React will supply the form data as the first argument to the server function. By passing the server functions to the form actions, React can progressively enhance the form. This means that forms can be submitted before the JavaScript bundle is loaded, because now you are, and they say progressively enhancement, because now all of the data is on the form. This means that the form can be submitted before the JavaScript bundle is loaded. So handling returns value in form. In the user request form, there might be the chance that the user name is not available. So request username should tell us is failed or not in that server function here. So to update the UI based on the result of a server function while supporting progressive enhancements, use actions. This is if you want to support this progressive enhancement here. And calling a server function outside of a form. And not only that, but serializable arguments and returns values. Use servers and use servers. Exactly. Server functions are designed for mutation that update server-side state. They're not recommended for data fetching. Accordingly, frameworks implementing server functions typically process one action at a time and do not have a way to catch the return value. So again, this is very narrow, specific of what we can do with the server functions, all right? And that is designed for mutation that update server-side state. They are not recommended for data fetching. So anytime you want, for example, submit a form, this is one of the main use case for this. And again, why forms? Because most of the time as UI developers, we are going to now write is forms. Okay? Forms as well as lists, rendering elements here in a list. So, okay, that was quite interesting, at least to understand what is the use case, what is the specific use case for that. And remember that this is to solve is React, or to solve Facebook problems, and not everybody has those kind of problems. So use server must be at the very beginning of their function or model. Above any code, including imports, comments about directives are okay. They must be written with a single or double quotes, not backticks. Use server can only be used in server-side files. The resulting server function can be passed to a client component through a props. And again, there are several types of props that you can pass through. So to import a server function from client code, the directive must be used at a model level. because of the underlying network calls are always asynchronous, useServer can only be used on async functions. Exactly. It means that on server functions here, always treat arguments to server function as on trust input and authorize any mutations. See security considerations here. Server functions should be called in a transition. Server function passed to form actions or form action will automatically be called in a transition. But again, once we now here are able to tell to these server actions, hey, this is now a reference that are going to pass to these client-side components, and in the case of the form, which is the reason of using server action is for mutations in Next.js, or at least in React. So, for example, forms is one of them, and what it's doing behind the scene is by once you create these server actions with the use server to mutate something, okay, not to fetch data, well, React behind the scenes, or the framework, particularly the framework, React, Next.js, Astro, or others, is creating now this reference between the server actions, the server function that is executing on the server, and the client components. So when you call that on the client, React will go to fire up a request that calls that function and returns something, right? So because this is what is going to return, or this is what is going to run, this mutation here, this also changed the way of how we now think our architectures, okay, especially with server components and client components. All right. Okay. So server components and server functions, right? So server component are a new type of components that render ahead of time before bundling in an environment separate from your client app or server-side render, right? But this server function, okay, as I mentioned, is allow you to do that. So by the time that this mutation is made, because that's the main reason of using server action.
So loading an error is actually pretty cool. So what if, so I know a while ago.
Is that, hey, once we run this mutation, all right, we want us to now revalidate that path. So this revalidation is known as the, which is pretty cool that actually, which is pretty cool that now, which is pretty cool that now we have this ability to reuse some of these existing standards, like catch while revalidate, which is something that we do that. But now frameworks like React, like Next.js, actually are now capable is to provide is this template engine, like all like PHP or Ruby or Python servers, web server allow you to do. So this revalidate path, which is now a function that it doesn't take that much, at least it doesn't mention that much, revalidate path. So revalidate path and revalidate tag. So this revalidate path. So this revalidate path is something that now is using is this HTTP catch control for stale control. Okay. So, so this is the stale while revalidate catch control. All right. So when pressing in an HTTP response, the stale while revalidate catch, which is now present on the headers, indicate that catch may serve the response in which appear after it becomes stale, up to indicated number of seconds. So this is now actually the HTTP stale control. So stale while revalidate, right? This is a couple of examples. So an example control is this: is catch control max age 600, stale while revalidate. There is also stale while revalidate here. Keeping things fresh with stale while revalidate. That is another interesting read, especially when we work with this. Keeping thing fresh with stale while revalidate. All right. And well, this is something that now Next.js actually dive into that, which is part of the revalidate, or this incremental static regeneration. But again, server actions and mutations, right? Data fetching and catching. All right. Server actions and mutations. That's one of the reason why we are actually looking at this. All right. For example, with forms. Right, to actually get that. So revalidate catch in this async function. You say, hey, this is not use server. In server-side form validation, using the server for that. So that was quite interesting. Revalidate catch, which is the Next.js catch here. But the thing here is that everything in Next.js, okay, to improve your application performance and reduce cost by catching rendering work, catch is doing by default. This page helps you to understand how Next.js works under the hood, but it's not essential knowledge to be productive with Next.js. Most of the Next.js catching heuristics are determined by your API usage and have default for the best performance with zero or minimal configuration. If you instead want to jump to examples, there you got it. Request memoization and all that kind of stuff. But in any case, we can talk about is for a week of catching and all that kind of stuff. So for example, like the revalidating, like so, time-based revalidating, on-demand revalidating. But again, full route catch. You might see the terms automatic static optimization, static site generation, or static rendering being used interchangeable to refer to the process of rendering catching route of your application at build time. So Next.js automatically render a catch route at build time. This is an optimization that allows you to serve the catch route exactly on rendering and server for every requests, resulting in faster page load. In any case, what we really care about here is that particular component, especially on revalidating and how, especially to keep things fresh, we're telling essentially to the next is the following. We make a server actions with the use server that change something in the database, make a mutation, we wait for that to happen, and then we tell next delete the cache of this page, all right? Delete the cache of this page / to do, which makes the page exactly deletes the cache for this page to do, which makes the page fetch all of the data all over again, which is in the to-do list, and putting on the page. So this understanding is quite important because this is interesting because it is based on web standard. So you can use React as a template engine and not have to rely on the heavy client side. So this template engine that in other frameworks we actually do that as it is with other languages like PHP or Python. Now with React we can do that server-side rendering. We can use React as a template engine. For example, Ruby, specifically Shopify, has this. So in Laravel you have Blade, which is the template engine, right? In Ruby, exactly in Ruby, for example, JavaScript, so yeah, just JavaScript, but template engines in Ruby. No, but it's like Shopify. It's Liquid. So Liquid is a template engine for that, similar to Laravel with Blade. And now we can look at React as a template engine for that. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Again, it all starts by now allow you to write its user interface on the client side. All right, so you don't have to now worry about to only exclusively write heavy client side applications, but also use React as a template engine with server components and server action. Holy moly. Holy moly. All right. Okay. Let's get into the next one.
Have you ever heard of, anyone ever heard of React Suspense? All right, never heard of React Suspense. So React Suspense basically allows you to stream, you can basically stream the data in from a component and show some type of loading state while that's happening. And it's basically it's like asynchronous components almost. So you can wait for that component to load and show some type of loading component while that's loading. It's like the simplest way I can describe it.
No, well, the suspend is allow you to now is show something as a fallback while in the background loading something, right? While in the background loading is a component, and once that is done, now replace that with this.
There is a suspense component in which you can set that up manually, but we get that for free if we just make a loading JS file or TSX or JSX file in whatever directory in which a page or a layout is fetching data. So while that page or layout is fetching data, in the meantime, it would instantly show your loading component to the client, and then when your data comes back without an error, then it will show that component. So we get that for free just by making a new file. The same is true for error state. So if something errors out, we can show a component if while fetching data on that page errored out, we get that for free, which is basically what they introduced in, I don't know what version, don't quote me, maybe 15, where they had error boundaries. It's basically that. You're just wrapping your page or layout in error boundary, which it's like a try catch for a component. It's the best way I can describe it. It's literally a try catch for a component, which is genius. So we get those for free. So let's check it out. So if I go to the to-dos folder here inside the dashboard, I can make a loading.tsx, right? And I can say this is loading, and I'm just gonna return a div that says loading like that. Export default that. So we have that, and then just to demonstrate the loading, I'm just going to exaggerate how long this takes. So I'm just going to wait a promise right quick on this get data inside of to-dos.
Is a problem to set them out here. I will have to use as an observable for that, but in any case, we're going to use with the native tool.
Say 2 seconds.
I don't need to install anything else.
So I'm just going to wait that. You don't have to add this in if you don't want to be dramatic, but yeah, I'm just waiting that. So we get that 2 seconds there. We have our loading file. It just says loading. Let's see what happens. So now if I go back and I refresh this, you can see it's loading, and then boom, 2 seconds later, it shows up, right? We got that for free. All we have to do is make a file, right? And it's instant. So I think that's pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
And the loading component, the loading files are client components, so you can do client things in here. I think by default they are. I don't think you need to do this. I don't think this even changes anything because they have to be client components, so they can, because you're already there on the client. So if it had to go make a round trip to the server to show, that would defeat the point. it just swaps it out.
That will defeat the point.
And the same is true for error. So if we
this have to be client component because if it's on the server side, it's going to defeat the purpose. So you have to now show something on the user.
go and make an error one like this,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much just gonna copy the same thing. Don't need to use client. Call this the
Error.
UI. I can't call it error with capital E because that's already a thing in JavaScript. So I'll just say error here, error UI, and just do something like oops. All right, so we got that.
We got
And
that.
I'm just gonna make this thing error, and the best way to do that in my example is just to call reject. So I'm just gonna reject this.
We're gonna reject this. Then.
That.
And that'll be all.
So after 2 seconds, it should load, and then it should
load.
freak out. So let's see what happens.
Exactly.
What is this? What do you want? Oh, I think it does want that.
Oh, it's on the error
It wants me to use
page.
client here. There we go. Cool.
No,
And what is this one?
add use client
Oh, it wants me
directive.
to use, like freak out. So let's see what happens.
Error TX must be client component and use client directive.
What is this?
That's interesting.
What do you want?
Okay.
Oh, I think it does want that.
Yeah,
So,
you need to
I'll
put
don't
this
really have
there.
to do anything. Like, yeah, you could do this in React yourself, but like setting this up, been there. It's a lot of work.
Yep. So we got convenient methods as we explored before based on the file based routing. Based on the file-based routing, we can use some predefined files to predefined files to help us with most common use cases. Right? So loading and error, right? So let's get into that. By the way, it will be nothing too wild, you know. Adding the form data to make it much more interesting, and then we go to this, the to-do, and we say, hey, this will be the loading TSX. This will run is only on the client side. It makes sense to do that. And in fact, it's creating now a suspense component. For those who are not familiar with suspense, this is now the way of how you can put some fallback content as the while in the background now you are loading components, and then once that is done, you show them up. So here we say, hey, this will be now our loading components, loading, right? And since this will be now a GSX function, where we say, hey, return is this, wait, what? Div, and say, hey, loading, loading. We're gonna export this, export the default as loading, right? Export this as a default model, EX6 model, all right? And if you want to actually now to see that loading, we say, hey, I want to now use a promise to say, hey, event loops now, I want to resolve this, okay? I want to do something like this. I want to create now a new promise, all right? Say this is a new promise. That's gonna take the executor, all right, which is the name of this function that we pass here, where the first parameter is a resolve, and then after a set amount of time, I want you to now is run this callback here, which is the resolve, right? So after 2 milliseconds, right, I want you to do is this, but it has to be at the timer here. Okay. So once we create this new promise, we wait for the promise to be completed because we are now on the async, all right? And then, well, we resolve that. So once we load this, when we run, I think it's on the package.json, which is the .def, and then we say, hey, npm run def, right? We run that. We navigate to that. So let's go to the browser here. It's gonna show now the to-dos, and we should be able to show the loading here. That's right. This is the to-dos, that's right. And once we refresh here, this is because we can say, hey, I want you to now call this, right? After 2 milliseconds. That's right. Okay. Are we in the proper function? Yeah, get data. It's like, well, it's actually running because we are not awaiting for that. Okay, we need to await for that. That makes a lot of sense. So we await for this program to be completed. So we show the loading, and then we show the data. And of course, we show you here like this one. Loading. All right, so when you refresh this, you say loaded, and then you can see is whatever data that we get in our database, right? The same for the error here. We say, hey, this is not the error, .tsx. We must, for this, indicate is the use client, which to me is quite interesting. Use client, this is a client component. And we define is this function, say error. We're gonna copy and paste this one, right? Then we say is, hey, for this instance, all right? So for all of this instance, okay. And this is error, so error UI.
Oh, I think it. Oh, it wants me to. Okay, cool. It wants me to put the use client there. After 2 seconds to do that, in my example, do something like error UI. I can't call it error capital E because that's already a error UI. Same thing. Don't need to use client. Call this the.
You see? It doesn't work here. What is this? With error.
Error UI. Can't call.
Okay, they say error UI. Say oops. And then you need to define this as an error client. So, and if in this case we wanted to say, hey, on the page to do, instead of passing the result, we're going to say it's the rejected. right? So after an X amount of time, well, I want to now reject this, right? So it means that by the time we go here, we see the loading, and now, oops, there's an error, right? That's quite interesting. And this requires a lot of work, a lot of work.
Like, yeah, you could do this in React yourself, but like setting this up, been there. It's a lot of work. Yes.
How would you do form validation here?
How would you do? You need client side. If you're gonna do form validation, which requires client side logic, then you. So basically, the goal is try to push client far down the tree as far as you can, right? So like, if you realize like, I need form validation here, make sure that you take the only part that needs form validation, take it out and put it in its own component and make that a client. Don't punish the rest of that component or the rest of that page and force it to be client because you need just some logic just for this one part. For the one part that you need, make another component, make that a client. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah, yes.
If you wanted to redirect on like form submit success, would you still use revalidate path and just put in a different URL or, well, a different path?
Yeah, so
if you wanted to redirect on like form submit success, would you still use revalidate path and just put in a different URL or, well, a different path?
Yeah, so revalidate path won't do any redirecting. It will just clean the cache
It will
out
clean
for
the
that
cache
path.
for you.
But there is a redirect. Let's see. Not that one. It's like from next server, I believe. Let me see. Maybe not there. They do have a redirect method that you can use to redirect anywhere if you want to go there.
How would you do authentication checks? Do middlewares?
So I do have a thing about middleware. So there is no right answer on how to do authentication checks. You can do them wherever you need things to be protected. So because server actions run on the server, you can do authentication checks in here as well if you wanted to. You get access to the cookie. You can use cookies in here. You can say cookies or cookie. I don't know why it's trying to pull from here, but Next.js has a cookie thing. So you can access the cookies here, and you have some authentication there, or maybe the authentication's on the headers. You can use that inside of this server action, which should give you more than enough information you need to lock down this server action, or whatever you want to do. And the same is true for any server-side logic. I mean, which means you could also prevent someone from going to a page if you wanted to, on the server side. Like in this page, you could just check the cookies on this page. Like, nah, you can't go here. So you can totally do that too. It's up to you. Middleware is more app-wide authentication, like just protect, don't even show this route at all unless they pass this, which is another way. And then you also have like API authentication protection all the way down to database layer. So I don't think there's one way. I think you just need to figure out where all your points of attacks are, or all the places you need to protect, and then do the right strategy for that. So
Someone was asking about if the actions.ts is running on the server, it means it runs on the server via node, while others, which are someone was asking about if the actions.ts is running on the server, it means it runs on the server via node, while others, which are client-side, runs on the browser.
yes, 100%.
Where what?
.ts is running.
Attacks are all the places you need to protect, and then do the right strategy for that. So
Someone was asking about if the actions.ts is running on the server, it means it runs on the server via node, while others, which are client-side, runs on the browser.
yes, 100%.
I can barely hear that, man.
Actions.ts is running on the server, it means it runs on the server via node, while others, which are client-side, runs on
This route at all, and unless they pass this, which is another
barely
way.
hear you, man.
And then you also have like API authentication protection all the way down to database layer. So I don't think there's one way. I think you just need to figure out where all your points of attacks are, or all the places you need to protect, and then do the right strategy for that. So
Someone was asking about if the actions.ts is running on the server, it means it runs on the server via node, while others, which are client-side, runs on the browser.
yes, 100%. Server means it's running in the node environment on a machine, whether it's yours in development or whatever machine you deployed it to. And use client means it's running in the browser like any other React component you've ever made does.
Can the actions.ts process be ahead of time compiled?
Like any other React component you've ever made does.
Can the actions.ts process be ahead of time compiled?
I don't think it can be AOT because I think it has to be dynamic in nature. I mean, I guess I'm not sure exactly what they mean by AOT compile. Like, are they saying the TypeScript? Are they saying... Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, ahead of time could be anything. I mean, this definitely can't be static, if that's what they're getting to. Like, this has to be dynamic. It's an action that has to be performed on. Like, you don't want to memorize this or cache this by default, although you can, depending on what you use, like fetch, or you can opt into Next.js's new caching mechanism. They have a cache function that you can use to pretty much cache anything. But no, from my understanding, well, that's the thing with Next.js. You don't really need to or have to put too much concern into how things are being compiled. It's pretty much handled for you. That's why they have conventions. If you follow their conventions, then you opt into their performance. Yes.
What about conditional error messages based on the error type?
Conditional error messages based off the error type.
The error
That's a good
type.
question.
That's a good question.
I know with error boundaries, you get access to the error object in the props. I don't know if you get that in the error file. That's a good thing to look at the docs for. Let's see. If you do, then that's. Oh yeah, you do.
Oh, you
there you go.
exactly.
So yeah, you could do that.
You can actually get that error for that.
Error here. You also get like a reset here. I knew about the reset without the error. So yeah, you can just grab the error here, look at the error.type, error.message, and this would
type, all of the error interface.
Give you some incentive to create a really good error system in your application that had different error codes and things that your error messages can use to display different types of errors or UIs and things like that. And because this is a client component, you can do whatever the hell you want. So it works. Yes.
The page is kind of blinking every time you submit a new to-do due to the revalidate path function. Is there a way to avoid this?
Yes.
The page is kind of blinking every time you submit a new to-do due to the revalidate path function. Is there a way to avoid this? I suppose it's kind of reloading the page or doing some sort of interpreting of the CSS.
Yeah, so let me see. Like that? Yeah, so I mean, that's because it's literally doing a full...
Or doing some sort of interpreting of the CSS.
Yeah, so let me see. Like that? Yeah, so I mean, that's because it's literally doing a full re-render of that page. The only way to avoid it is kind of what I said earlier. If you need your UI to update off of server mutation, you should probably just use client instead. So I would just go back to what you were doing before server actions came and handle your mutations client side, and that way you have more control. I think server mutations are really, really good for side effects and things that don't need, where the UI is depending on a response, because then you do have to ask yourself questions like that. Well, how do I create a really slick UI that doesn't like flicker like that or something like that? Yeah, you could probably get around it. You could do some smart caching. You could do some layout stuff. Like, I'm sure you can figure out a way, but if you just did it on the client, you're probably just better off that way for now. Me personally, I'll probably use server actions for like tracking, analytics, stuff like that, webhooks, things like that happen in the background. But when it comes to UI, I'll probably still do client stuff for now. Any other questions?
Is it better to use Next.js routing, which is file-based, or use custom React routing? I think you already covered React routing earlier, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to use Next.js routing, you should probably not use Next.js. That's like the whole point of it. So, yeah, I would, if you don't want to use it or whatever, I would just use React or go look at another framework like Gatsby or Remix or something like that.
Or Astro.
Cool.
Or not.
Any other questions?
I guess kind of going off of that, what if you want to have, or you have like large application where maybe one file you want to be more like a SPA SPA? Is that something that you can integrate, or?
Yeah, I mean, so if you just want one route to be a SPA, no problem. You would just go in here. Let's say I don't know. Let's pick a file. No, I don't want to pick a file because it's gonna break everything. Let's just make a file. Let's make a new folder, and we'll just call this SPA. And we'll just say page.tsx, right? Well, first thing you do, boom. Basically a SPA right now, right? And then from there, the only thing you have to think about. So now you know you're not doing React server components, but you still got to think about server-side rendering. You got to figure out like, well, what if I'm doing like Windows stuff in here, right? And there's a lot of ways to do that. You basically just make sure that anything that involves a window, you just wrap an if statement that, hey, if window is here, that means we're on the server, so don't do this.
Exactly.
Right?
This is essentially you're telling to hey, this will be now an SPA.
For that. And yeah, that's pretty much all you would need to do. Like, this basically opts you back into like SPA land, right? And you don't have to worry about it, at least for this page. And I think that's what the Next.js team is trying to. They're trying to make sure that like that's your choice. Is that like you start off with everything being server, everything being performant in their preferred way, and then when you want to just kick back out, like, for this page, it's actually a video game that I'm making, so it has to be a single page application. Yeah,
or
cool.
any backup applications.
Just be cautious of server-side.
You can actually render that.
Yeah, at this point, it's the same thing that Next.js used to be. So if you ever use Next.js 12, this is Next.js 12 land right here. where it's like all you're doing is rendering. All you're doing is worrying about server-side rendering. And there might be even a way to opt out of server-side rendering. I don't know how to do it in the app router land, but I know in the pages router land you could. So you might even just say, don't even render this thing on the server at all, which I can look up, but I don't know how to do that in this version. Cool. Any other questions?
Since we're handling most of the data on the server side, do we still need state management libraries like Redux?
It's a great question.
It's a great
You would only need
question.
state management libraries like that on client components that needed state management. So I'll give you an example. To-do form. I don't have to do this on the server. In fact, I personally probably wouldn't. I would probably do this on a client. So I would do a use state here and do an on change on the input, the traditional form. I would traditionally just do that because I want control over the UI. So I would do the same thing there, and I would still have my, if there was some other app that needed to know about that state, I would have that state management here, and it would know about it. So you still get that. You're still not gonna have, because like once you get into the browser,
Land.
you are on client-side land. Like there's still hydration happening for the things that need to be hydrated. React is still being loaded, so you're still gonna have that client-side interaction, even though all your pages that you might have rendered are just HTML. That just means that those pages don't have any JavaScript on them. So basically, if you just make sure that all the code, I mean, in React, Next.js will tell you, if you try to do anything with like a hook or a state, it'll say you need to do use client. So you can't miss it. Like you can't mess it up because it'll just be like, oh, you can't run this function. You got to put use client at the top. So once you do that, then it's just like it's like anything you've ever done. Nothing's changed. So you won't even have to think about that scenario. Only thing you have to think about is that like I can't do this on a component that doesn't have use client. And even then, it would tell you that you can't do that either. Like this doesn't work here. So it's kind of hard to mess up. And I think that's the right way for them to do it, is that you can just do whatever you normally have done by opting into it. So yes, you would probably still need state management. The other reason is that like state on the server is global, so every person shares the same state, assuming it's not in like some serverless environment, at least in development mode. So like, yeah, you don't want to be sharing, like imagine you just saw someone typing in your form, like that'd be weird. So yeah, you don't want to share state across multiple instances of a client, across of a stateful server, because the server will be stateful in the execution time. So yeah.
If we have a server component inside it client and inside of its server, how is this loaded?
Yeah.
If we have a server component inside it client and inside of its server, how is this loaded?
That's a great question. So you are able to load server components and clients and servers. It's basically, it's going to be loaded in the order in which you rendered it, right? Actually, Next.js has a good example of this, so I don't have to write a very long one. Let me find it. Let's see if they have that code example. Yeah, basically, here it is. So basically, there are some caveats with how you can, like I said, it comes down to what's being loaded first and like what props you're passing to it. But here's an example of like what's not supported. So like you cannot just by default import a server component into a client component. So like for instance, here's a client component, you have the server component and you're trying to bring it in. So by default that won't work. So instead you have to, in this example, they're wanting you to like use a prop as a server component in which you can render it that way, right? So in this case, you can pass the server component as a child prop of the client component, right? So you're not actually rendering the server component in the JSX of the client component. Instead, your client component is acting more of a layout or a template in which it renders any children that are passed to it. And then through some intermediary server component, you can import that client component and have the server component be a child of it. Basically, you just literally cannot import a server component into a client component. Can they be rendered next to each other? Yeah, like this. You just can't import it in. You have to find a way to do it this way. You can only import a server component into another server component, but you can import a client component into a server component.
But you can't import a client component into a server component.
Any questions on that? That's kind of confusing. I had to think about it for a minute. I was like, No, they have a good write-up on it here, though, that talks about all the things.
They have a good write-up on this one.
So do the two server components run first?
Do the two server components run first?
To the two server components run first.
Well, because they happen on the server, they would get executed, and then the client will probably be server-side rendered, so they will all probably be ran near the same time, The only difference is the client component will then be bootstrapped on the front end, whereas the server components won't. And near the same time, the only difference is the client component will then be bootstrapped on the front end, whereas the server components won't.
So with the form example, we use client, does the validation and wrap this server component into the client component in order to pass the props to the server component, or do the data fetching and stuff?
I think the question was, because we have this to-do form here that's being rendered inside of a server component, how does the server component pass down props to the form if the form was a use client, if it was a client component? And what does that look like? As long as it's a serializable prop, it's going to be fine.
Exactly.
So you
as
shouldn't
long as this is a serializable prop,
have a big deal
it'll
there.
be
But I
fine.
think what they're asking is like, well, how does the server component that's rendering this to-do form know when this form was submitted? Because it can't like call a function or something like that. Yeah, it wouldn't, because you can't pass a function as a prop. So either this will have to remain server like it is now, or you make this a client, and then you also make the thing that needs to know when this thing is done a client, and then those would be two client components, because there's no other way around it. So that's when you opt back into like, oh, either I just need to figure out a way to push this down even further, or like everything that needs this is just going to be a client. Like, it's not wrong to have a client component. Like, I don't want people to like avoid them like the plague. Like, that is not the case. Use clients as much as you need, you know, but the way you should be thinking about it is like only when you need it. So it should be less of them, not because they're bad, but because you don't need them as much as you thought you did.
Well, that'll be all for this video.
Oh yeah, we
Take
left off
care.
on
Bye bye.